All right. Well, I'm delighted to be joined today by Secretary of State Jim Baker, also Secretary of the Treasury, also former White House Chief of Staff, and most importantly, our guest today for this conversation on the anniversary of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And so, Secretary Baker, I thought we should take as a starting point for our conversation your views about this moment that we find ourselves in. When you were Secretary of State, it really was one of those hinge moments in history, the period that we would come to see as the end of the Cold War. And I'm wondering what lesson you think the end of the Cold War holds for today's moment. Is this another hinge moment in history that we're living through?
Well, I'm not sure it's the same kind of a hinge moment that we lived through as the Cold War came to an end, Susan, although I do think it could be. We are in the process, in my view, of beginning a Cold War with another adversary, China, an adversary that is every bit as strong, if not stronger, and potentially more dangerous to U.S. interests than the Soviet Union was. Soviet Union was in decline by the time I became Secretary of State in 1989. We still have the problems. We've reverted back to a Cold War with Russia. You know, people forget that for 15 years after the implosion of the Soviet Union, the United States and NATO, the West generally, had good relations with Russia under the governments of both Yeltsin and Putin. People have forgotten that. But I think it's not a stretch to say that we're at the same kind of a moment perhaps in history. Time will tell, but we are in a Cold War with the People's Republic of China. I'm sad to say, because I'm one who pushed very hard when I was in office to get China admitted to the WTO. And we were successful. We thought mistakenly that if she were admitted to that body, she would change some of her behavior and some of her approaches to world affairs and to domestic politics as well. We were wrong. It didn't happen. And it's regrettable that it didn't. And now we find ourselves in a very, at least in the very beginnings, I'm afraid to say, of a Cold War with China, and not to mention the fact that we're back in one with Russia.
Well, a lot of people ask me, well, what are the lessons that we could draw from the successful diplomacy to bring the first big Cold War with the United States and the Soviet Union to a more or less nonviolent ending? And, I guess people forget that our dealings in some ways with the Soviet Union in its final days, certainly your relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev and with Edward Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, you were closer with them than we are with Russia today in many respects.
That's very true, Susan. And I think that the lessons we learned from the Cold War are lessons that we would be well to remember today. And that some of those were, of course, the fact that don't ever, when you get your enemy behind the eight ball, don't push him too hard. George H.W. Bush understood that. When the wall came down, he didn't dance on the ruins of the wall, even though he's criticized roundly in the United States for not being more emotional about it. But he knew we still had business to do with the Soviet Union, and he didn't stick it in the eye of Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. That's one lesson. Another one, of course, is the importance of personal relationships in diplomacy. It's really important to have the best personal relationship you can with your interlocutor across the table, because you got a hell of a lot better chance of getting stuff done if you have that. That doesn't mean that you compromise your principles and values, or you shade anything in terms of your support for your country. So those are a couple of the lessons. And then the other one, I think, is the importance of strength and consistency in foreign policy. We won the Cold War because every American president, from Harry Truman through George H.W. Bush, was consistent and strong and determined to oppose Soviet expansionism. And we did so, and we won as a consequence. Those are some of the lessons I think we can take from the way the Cold War ended.
You know, it's interesting. I was just looking at this quote from one of your predecessors as secretary the other day, Henry Kissinger, who wrote back in the 60s that the scope for diplomacy is greatest in a period of big change like we're seeing right now, when the old order is obviously disintegrating while the shape of its replacement is highly uncertain. Everything depends, therefore, on some conception of the future. So what was your conception of the future when you realized how quickly the old order was disintegrating? You know, November 9th, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's not something that anybody really expected to happen on that day. How quickly did you have a vision of what the future might look like?
Well, we put in place some principles and some structures, some organizations. For instance, we brought Russia into the councils of NATO in a role that was not full membership, but that was a consultative role. That worked for a while. That was the right thing to do. It's too bad that it didn't work forever, but it didn't. We had the view that it was really important that we be there, continue to be there for our longtime allies who had helped us prevail in the Cold War, and we strengthened some of those institutions. Those are some of the things that come to mind as far as I'm concerned.
You know, you mentioned the importance of the personal in diplomacy. At times, you might have found it harder to negotiate with your allies than with your adversaries, both in American domestic politics, maybe on Capitol Hill, but also when, you know, came to the fall of the Berlin Wall. It wasn't just Gorbachev that you were dealing with, or even the Germans, but you know, allies like Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand were very resistant to that idea.
Absolutely, they did not want to see Germany unified or reunified, whichever term you want to use, because they were afraid history would repeat itself. Germany had started 2 world wars in that century. They were afraid it might happen again if they went along with German unification. I remember Margaret saying, you know, I like Germany so much that I think there ought to be 2 of them in opposing German unification. So we had to overcome the objections, not just of the Soviet Union to German unification, but strong objections from our allies like France and Britain.
What do you think? It's interesting to talk about the role of alliances as you think about, you know, how to construct a new order. And right now, of course, with China, and you have the early stages of what could turn out to be, as you put it, a new Cold War. The United States seems to be once again leaning into the idea of alliances, right? You have both the Trump administration and now the Biden administration embracing the Quad, which is for democratic powers in Asia, and as a sort of a new kind of alliance organized around the possible security challenges of China. Does that make sense to you? Is the Quad going to become kind of the NATO for the East? And what do you think makes sense? Because China is not like Russia and the Soviet Union. China is not a declining power at this point in time, but one that is much more assertive than it has been in the past.
That's correct, and that may be all the more reason why we need to beef up our alliances and create new ones. I don't think there's anything at all wrong with the idea of creating an alliance for the Pacific. Throughout history, alliances have been a force multiplier for American power, for American policy. our alliances, both in the Pacific and in Europe, have been the source of great strength for America's interest and values and for America's diplomacy. We rely on those alliances. They give us a lot of extra leverage, and they're very important. So I support the building of alliances and the maintaining of alliances.
Secretary Baker, I know we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you just a final question about American leadership in the world right now. You obviously were the secretary at a unique moment in history when the decline of the Soviet Union meant that the United States was in a position of being essentially the world's only superpower. It was a sort of an exceptional moment in history. This is a different moment in history where that is no longer the case, and we seem to be in a world of renewed great power competition. Do you think that the political will exists inside the United States today to maintain a position of international leadership for the United States? There's a lot of indications that on the left and the right, Americans no longer have the zeal for international leadership.
I sadly think you're right on that comment. There indications are that both the left and the right politically in this country are moving away from that, and that is extraordinarily regrettable, because when the United States is involved internationally, we are a force for peace and stability. People know we're not in the game to get into their sandbox, take some of their interest or assets. We don't want it. We're not seeking conquest, and so it's really important that we stay involved internationally, that we stay involved beyond our borders. It enhances the security of the American people, and it's very, very important. We go through these phases of America first, where we say, well, the worst thing in the world is we're sending foreign aid to these countries. Well, sometimes we may go too far in foreign aid, but for the most part, it's a very small percentage of our budget, and we get a great return on it. But more important than anything else is that we remain involved. We are a force. The United States of America is a force for peace and stability in the world when we're involved, and we need to stay involved.
Well, that seems like an important note to end it on. It's, I think, notable that you have at least part of the Republican Party as represented by Secretary Baker, who still remains a proponent of internationalism in the world and American leadership. So I want to thank you for this conversation. I'm sure we both congratulate Ambassador Daalder and the Chicago Council on its anniversary as well. But Secretary Baker, thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Secretary Baker and Susan Glasser, for that insightful conversation. If you want to see the extended interview, just go to the YouTube link at the bottom of the description below. My name is Ivo Daalder. I'm the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I'm honored to welcome you to our discussion on the end of the Cold War and the world it created. This is part 3 of our series on the century of global leadership. Next year, in February, the Council will celebrate its centennial anniversary, and this series offers an opportunity to reflect on the key themes and pivotal periods that shaped the Council's first century. Today's topic is one that took the spotlight during a significant portion of the Council's history, and we're delighted to use this opportunity to look back at that history and to explore how our world today was shaped by the Cold War. Before I start the conversation with our distinguished panel, I'd like to remind our viewers that the Council is an independent, nonpartisan organization and that the views expressed by the speakers we host are their own and do not necessarily represent those of the Chicago Council. Now, I have the privilege to introduce today's panelist. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer at The Atlantic, a senior fellow at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, and a prize-winning historian. Fareed Zakaria hosts Fareed Zakaria GPS for CNN Worldwide and he is a columnist for the Washington Post, a contributing editor to The Atlantic, and a best-selling author. And Robert Zoellick served as president of the World Bank Group, as U.S. Trade Representative, and as Deputy Secretary of State. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. As we just heard, Secretary Baker spoke about the importance of personal relationships and diplomacy. And let me just, Bob, start off with a really broad question. When you think about the Cold War, to what extent is that a conflict between systems or structures or nations? And how do personalities of the leaders of countries affect that nature of that relationship?
Well, first, Ivo, thanks for the invitation. And it's glad to be back in the Midwest, even if only virtually. So as is many cases, Ivo, the answer is both. Now, in the case of Secretary Baker, his strength was as a problem solver and negotiator. And if you're going to operate with other people, you have to have some sense of reliability and trust to be able to conduct negotiations. It also helps to understand your counterparts, to understand where they're coming from, their red lines, their sort of political constraints. This doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make concessions based on that, but you have to understand where they're coming from. So to get slightly more specific, to take one example, in early 1989, in terms of alliance relationships, the INF treaty, which had been for the intermediate range missiles, had just removed all the middle range nuclear weapons, but the only ones left in Europe were the short range nuclear missiles. And NATO had committed to modernize those. But it was very unpopular in Germany because, as one of the Germans said, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. And so part of the understanding of that was something that Bush and Baker came up with, which was a very bold conventional forces initiative to reduce the armies and airplanes on both sides, which moved the short-range nuclear issue, frankly, to the background. Now, that required some understanding of where your colleagues were. Another one that's pretty well known is the fact that when the Berlin Wall came down, President Bush was criticized for not dancing on the wall or showing more exuberance, but he was very alert to the fact that he didn't want to complicate Gorbachev's situation as he was going to try to draw Gorbachev towards him. And Gorbachev acknowledged this a month later at Malta. But then also, just to give you a sense of how this cuts across administrations, Ronald Reagan was known for a very strong ideological view about the evil empire, known for a very strong ideological view. He was also a negotiator, and that's something that many of his team in the White House had not emphasized enough. And Schultz, when he came as Secretary of State, had a conversation with Helmut Schmidt, the former Chancellor of Germany, who said, this is dangerous. We don't have any personal contact. And one of the roles that Schultz played with Ronald Reagan, what I think is important to understand in this is that at some level, you've got interactions among human beings, problems. It helps to have some degree of understanding and, better yet, trust.
And add to that, in some ways, the reason the Cold War remained cold is exactly because of that personal interaction. And yet, it was a war because there was a fundamental conflict of systems, of people, and of nations. And how should we think about this period at the relative balance between those two?
It's always tempting to look at these conflicts as conflicts of personalities because then it's easier to understand them. It makes for a better narrative. It helps people explain the circumstances. But you're right that fundamentally we are talking about political systems where the leadership more broadly, not just the person who happened to be Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party or President of the United States, people more broadly saw the world in very different ways. And because of that, Bob was just talking about, misunderstandings happening. Misunderstandings happened all the time precisely because of that. Americans always found it very hard to believe that Soviet leaders really believed the stuff they spoke about. They don't really believe their ideology. They're really cynical. They're really Russian nationalists. They're really something else. Actually, all the evidence is, particularly once now that we have access to archives, they did believe it. They did think they were following a plan. They were fulfilling a prediction essentially made by Marx and then elaborated on by Lenin. and that was how they were seeking to structure the world. And a lot of the mistakes we made with the Soviet Union were failing to see that. I mean, you could get along with a particular leader. Some of our leaders even got along with Stalin. Certainly, we spoke to all of them. To Khrushchev, we tried to see him as a kind of jolly, friendly person. But that sometimes led us to not to understand what were the deeper forces at work. There is one important point, which is that at the very end of the Soviet Union, the role of Gorbachev, just as an individual personality, is really important, partly because he himself was an anachronism. In other words, he was already someone he still believed in the system. He believed that what he was doing was reforming it, was sort of saving communism for itself, repairing and fixing the Soviet Union. And he was actually someone who didn't understand his own country and didn't understand the degree to which the elite around him, the rest of the Communist Party, and particularly the KGB, had already lost faith in the system and already didn't want to support it. And so he's almost a kind of tragic historical figure who still believes, yet is, whose belief is taken over by events. And actually, in that sense, he's quite important because his willingness to speak to Americans opened the gates for a larger change, even one that he didn't want.
Fareed, I think Anne's absolutely right that Gorbachev is a particular important person to help explain why we came to the end of the Cold War at the time that we did. Is the same true on the U.S. side? Was Ronald Reagan the necessary to get to this point, or it was in fact the balance of forces between the two sides had so changed over time that no matter who was leading in either side of the conflict, this was going to come to an end? How do you see those sort of larger historical forces?
So Reagan, I think, is pivotal for the timing. He accelerates the buildup, particularly the buildup with things like SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which scares the Soviets. But I think the broader reality of the Soviet Union collapsing under its own weight, triggered by Afghanistan, would probably have happened anyway. So I tend to think of Reagan as being an important figure, and I think that his policies toward the Soviet Union, broadly speaking, did accelerate the demise. But I think the larger systemic struggle, the balance of power had shifted pretty decisively away from the Soviet Union for all kinds of technological, economic, and military reasons, and most profoundly because the Soviet Union was, as somebody once put it, encircled by a ring of hostile communist countries, meaning all its supposed allies in the Warsaw Pact hated the Soviet Union and were, trying to kind of unshackle themselves. But let me say that I think I was trained as a political scientist, so trained to believe that structure is all important, that personalities are less important than we think they are, and I think that structure and systemic conflict does make a big difference. But the older I've gotten, the more I realize that it intersects in kind of interesting and surprising ways with personality. So we were talking about the end of the Cold War, but if you look at the beginning, you see the same thing. The United States in 1950 was demobilizing, massively demobilizing. It was conceiving of the Cold War very much in the way that George Kennan wrote about it, as largely a kind of political, ideological contest. Then comes the Korean War. North Korea invades South Korea, and that triggers a massive rebuilding of the American military and defense establishment. It really creates the military-industrial complex. It creates the militarized Cold War that we now think about, and of course the strategic concept that came out of it was to use Paul Nitzer's NSC-68, a much more hawkish military document compared with Kennan. Now, why did that happen? We know that Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, had gone to Mao and Stalin earlier on, essentially asking for permission to invade South Korea. They said no once, Stalin particularly. He comes back a second time, and he gets a yes. we now know from Soviet archives that that seems to have had something to do with Dean Acheson's speech, in which he very famously leaves South Korea outside of the perimeter of countries that the United States is going to defend. So you see my point, that is that the personalities here, Acheson making that speech, Kim Il-sung deciding to go, Stalin first saying no, then saying yes, all of which feels a little more contingent than broad structural clashes. Now, there would have still been systemic competition. There would have still been some kind of a Cold War. But would it have been quite as militarized had the Korean War not taken place? I don't know. I think it's a very interesting question, and it does seem to rest centrally on a few personalities.
Fascinating, the interaction between the two. And as a good political scientist, we do different levels of analysis. So you have people and structure all at the same time and intersecting in order to explain and help explain history. Bob, you were there at the end of the Cold War. You mentioned that President Bush didn't want to go dance on the top of the Berlin Wall. But if you look back at that time, I mean, what was most surprising to you? You came into power with the administration in 1989. The end of the Cold War really wasn't on the agenda, and yet there it was. And sort of what explains that? What do you, when you look back, said why did it happen when it happened at that particular time?
Well, you could clearly see that the ice of the Cold War was breaking, but there was huge uncertainty. As Anne mentioned, about exactly what Gorbachev was up to. Was it to re-strengthen the Soviet Union? Was he going to have fundamental change? This is where I think this interaction of structure and people does become important, because even if I think about it today, I think, frankly, the lack of our engagement with China is a dangerous process. You can come up with a sort of a political scientist's analysis of the relationship between the two countries, but communication is important on the front line and understanding what's really going on. And this is where Baker's role was quite important, because both Bush and Baker were very competitive people. Baker was on point. And so Baker really was the person trying to test what Gorbachev and Shevardnadze were thinking. However, I think one part that has been often lost in the histories was our focus was first on what we would call the German question as opposed to the Russian question, which most of the historians are focusing. We could see that the changes that were going on in Europe were going to put a lot of pressure on the core ally. And remember, the Cold War started in Berlin and the division of Germany in Europe. So this story I told about the Conventional Forces Initiative and the NATO summit and dealing with short-range missiles was quite important, because frankly, we wanted to strengthen the relationship with the German partner. This led to some tension, by the way, as people may recall, with Prime Minister Thatcher, who had been sort of the closest ally for Reagan. And so the question was, how could we, in the early part of 1989, strengthen our alliance partnerships while starting to test relations with the Soviets? Now, as for the causes, I mean, this is where I think the economic dimension becomes important. Keep in mind, the United States and the Western economies had struggled in the 70s with oil crises and structural reforms. But one of the, I think, the big changes that forced Gorbachev to consider his reforms, and as Anne said, I don't think he really understood what he was unleashing, was the fact that the Soviet Union was very dependent on energy. And as energy prices collapsed in the mid-'80s, he found himself in an untenable economic position. The United States, Britain, France had all managed to go through some very difficult economic reforms. And so the basic picture, and this was also bringing in Central and Eastern Europe, is compare life in the Federal Republic of Germany and East Germany. Compare life in Poland with that in France or the Scandinavian countries. So I think the economic dimension and the innovation, the technology changes and information side, these all gave the West a big advantage. Along with one other key part from the 80s, which is that the records are pretty clear that when the Soviets put in those intermediate range missiles, it was a test of NATO's coherence. And this was the so-called sort of dual track decision, putting in the intermediate range missiles in the West, but also being willing to negotiate. This led to the collapse of Schmidt's government. The Free Democrats moved to the Christian Democrats. And so the other part of this story is the fact of how the United States managed alliance relations. I mean, the big part of the Cold War and the change from America's past was having allies. We didn't have allies for the first 150 years. And people have somewhat assumed that that's a mechanistic process or that the allies will just go along with what the U.S. wants. It was never that case. And so the challenge was, how do you bring together your economic strength, your military deterrence, but also the political appeal of the West?
Do I know it well that allies don't necessarily do what we want them to tell them every day? So that's for sure. It's never changed. And you're sitting in Warsaw, and you know the American version of the end of the Cold War is we won, they lost. But the people in Eastern Europe, in Poland in particular, had a fundamental role to play and played a fundamental role both in how the Cold War was experienced in Eastern Europe and what it meant for the people there, but also in its end. And history is, you know, has many versions. And talk a little bit about the version where you're sitting, about how not just the Cold War was experienced, but how that experience in and of itself was a major contributor in some ways to ending it.
That's very true. I mean, it's funny, Bob was talking about the beginning of the Cold War in Berlin. Here in Warsaw, we think the Cold War began in Poland. And so that already tells you something about the perspective, you know, that is different depending on where you sit. Poland being the country whose Eastern occupation by what we would now call little green men, kind of Russian troops pretending to be Polish communists liberating the eastern part of the country, that was really the first sign, even before the Red Army got to Germany, that was the really first sign of the Soviet Union's intentions, that as it was marching west towards the end of the war, that it was going to treat all of the territories that it occupied as not as independent states to be liberated, but as new satrapies, new kind of satellite states that whose system was going to be the Soviet system, and that was really the way that the end of the war was experienced in the beginning of the Cold War in this part of the world, was of this imposition of what was everywhere a foreign system. Some people wanted that to happen, and there were local communists, which is something that is sometimes forgotten now. And there were also lots of people who just wanted the war to be over and didn't want to fight anymore. So, it's not as if everybody joined the resistance immediately, but the experience was very much of foreign occupation. The communist system, the local communists always had, in every single one of these countries, including East Germany, always had difficulty explaining to their to the people they were trying to persuade and bring along to their compatriots that they were natives. I mean, to the extent that the Polish Communist Party actually had a phase of being quite nationalist, almost using very what we would now call xenophobic, national ethnocentric language, precisely because it was trying to convince the people that look, we're really Polish. But the experience was one of foreign occupation, and there was a constant comparison of what life is like here compared to what life is like in the other half of Europe. And the other half of Europe was seen as more successful, more prosperous, more interesting, in every way better. And that was something that really starts in the 1940s and continues right up to the very end. And of course, when you talk about the end of the Cold War, again, here in Warsaw, but also to some extent in Prague and even in Budapest, we also think we helped cause that. So the first really big and really important grassroots anti-communist movement led by workers, remember the Communist Party was supposed to be the party of the working class, but the worker-led anti-communist movement was Polish. And that was 1981. And the influence of that movement and the sort of longer term echo that it had around Central Europe and then, even in the Soviet Union was very important in undermining both what remained of faith or belief in communist ideology, but also in belief or sort of fear of its effectiveness. I mean, once people saw that you could organize a 10 million member opposition movement, that the fear of the system was definitely loosened, and not only in Poland. Angela Merkel is somebody who I've heard privately talk about growing up in East Germany, her admiration for the Poles, who she met as a student traveling in the East, precisely because she saw them as not afraid, people who were able to stand up to this power, and that also had a huge impact on the whole region.
People movement started in the 1980s in this way, and I don't think you can really understand how the Cold War ended and how quickly it ended without that breakdown of fear and the willingness of people to stand up and try to claim their rights. I think that's a very important point. Fareed, you already started mentioning when you talked about Kennan versus Nietzsche on thinking about American foreign policy writ large and how it was shaped by the Cold War. But let me ask you go a little deeper. To what extent is really American foreign policy in the whole post-Cold War, the post-war period, really framed by and can only be understood through the lens of the Cold War, or is there something else going on? Are there more national characteristics or American characteristics? How to think about it? How does the Cold War shape American policy, both in a good way and in a bad way, as you think about the history of America's engagement with the world post 1945?
Oh, it was the dominant prism through which I think we saw the world in the United States. It became the dominant prism through which the world operated. I think it's very difficult to explain to young people today just how dominant the Cold War was as a way of organizing the world, because first of all, there was that sense of existential threat, partly because of nuclear weapons, but partly it was really about the direction of history. I grew up in India. You'd think somewhat far removed from all this, but yet the central dynamic politically that operated at a kind of as a meta narrative, even in India, is the world, broadly speaking, going in the direction of the United States and democracy and capitalism, or is it going in the direction of the Soviet Union and some kind of socialism? Nobody thought it was going in the direction of the kind of Leninist communist system, but it was seen that was the kind of polar anchor that in some sense created the dynamic that we all had to live with. And every decision, every country's move, whether in a Nicaraguan revolution, something happening in Angola, something happening in Cambodia, was all interpreted through this central dynamic. And we really don't have that today. Much as one might try to look at the Chinese and the American rivalry in the way, it's really not comparable in any sense. To begin with, modern China is a weird combination of Leninism and market economics. And so it doesn't really present that kind of systemic dynamic, polar opposition, even though Xi Jinping tries to pretend that it is. There also is not the same sense of existential fear. The rivalry, for the most part, geostrategically between the United States and China is largely around what is now being called the Indo-Pacific, really Asia, but we're sort of trying to drag India in as our ally, so we have now renamed the Asia to be the Indo-Pacific. I think that that fundamental dynamic operating at the geostrategic level, at the ideological level, at the political level, at the economic level, was so much more pervasive, so much larger than anything we've ever seen. Now, to my mind, the other dynamic that was operating throughout this period was that the United States was not just containing the Soviet Union, but was building what we now call the liberal international system. And I would argue that proved to be the killer app that won the United States the Cold War, more than all the little interventions in deposing governments in Africa and in Latin America, providing assistance, even going to war in Vietnam. The thing that ended up being the most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was that it created an open, rules-based free trade, democratic, capitalist system. I'm idealizing it somewhat. There were many areas where it wasn't quite that, but that vibrant, open world is what I think ultimately did the Soviet Union in. And as both Bob and Ann have pointed out, the kind of razor's edge of the comparison was always East Germany versus West Germany, Poland versus its neighbors to the west. And ultimately, the Cold War began to collapse precisely because of the frustration and protest in those countries in Eastern Europe, where, by the way, the United States had never militarily intervened, right? So all the kind of our machinations in places like Nicaragua and Southeast Asia were not ultimately what made the difference. What made the difference was that the United States had created this amazingly open, dynamic, prosperous world in the West, which stood in sharp contrast to the stagnant, repressive, decaying East.
I think you put it exactly right in this sort of this balance between the system that we build and the militarized version of the containment policy that we created. And Bob, does that help explain why the Cold War ended without a shot? That in some sense we already had the mechanisms for figuring out how to deal with a post-Soviet world, because we had created this rules-based international order. And of course, it wasn't by accident. Great diplomacy and engagement allowed us to negotiate that end rather than to fight it to the end, which so many of us during the Cold War itself thought was the only way this Cold War was going to end was through a war. But it didn't. It ended through negotiation and internal collapse in some ways.
So to pick up a little bit on Fareed's point, I think what's useful for younger generations to recognize was that the alliance system and the economic arrangements that were, I think, a key part of it, as Fareed mentioned, was not planned through some grand strategy. It was dealing with the problems of 1947, 1950. So keep in mind, the first step was the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was an idea to try to help with the economic recovery of Europe and, frankly, to avoid a military commitment. The second step was to recognize the Marshall Plan wouldn't work unless you had Germany part of it. And that's why I keep coming back to the critical role of Germany in past European history and in the Cold War and, frankly, going in the future. And so within 5 years of the end of World War II, the United States pushes for the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany. That leads to the Berlin crisis and all of a sudden a recognition that you do need a different security component. And the creation of Federal Republic of Germany also led those in Western Europe to say, well, we want to have some security protection. France didn't necessarily like this idea so much. And so you create the North Atlantic Alliance in 1949. And then as Fareed mentioned, the North Atlantic Alliance doesn't start out as a big military organization, which we then later know as NATO. That is precipitated by the attack in Korea in 1950. So in the course of 5 years, you've got a revolution in Americans' foreign policy. Remember back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, we wanted to avoid alliances. We didn't want to have permanent alliances, entanglement alliances. You could look at much of the 150 years of American foreign policy before that as how do you engage in the world without alliances. So you have this alliance structure, and that's important to recognize at the end of the Cold War. How does it change? How does its role? But as Fareed emphasizes, and I frankly believe this is important as well, sometimes we look too much at the military side. You have to look at what I emphasize as the economic adaptability, the trade, the innovation. And the reason this is critical is that the nature of the American alliance order allows partners to pursue their national interests while also supporting systemic interests. So, and that requires an ongoing negotiation on the part of the U.S. case. Now, with the end of the Cold War, and this brings back to Ann's point, there was definitely a view among us that the goal, as Bush said, was to create a Europe whole and free. And so in doing this, coming back to this German point, we had this question of a united Germany in the center of Europe had created some security problems over the course of 100 years. So that led to the logic of wanting to make sure that a united Germany was part of NATO and that you would have it integrated with, at that time, the European community, which became the European Union. That creates the basis for a Europe whole and free. And then as part of this, and this is an ongoing historical debate, we believe that we wanted that system to reach out towards Central and Eastern Europe. There was obviously at early stages, there was a question of would the European Union enlarge, what would be the possibilities of NATO. But I recall back in college reading a book by Alan Palmer called The Lands Between, and it was the sense of leaving the countries of Central and Eastern Europe in this vacuum. Now this then leads to the question about what's your relationship with Russia? And of course, at least from my point of view, the West tried to offer opportunities for Russia to engage in that system. Others believe that NATO enlargement and others provoked Russia. My own view on that is the events within Russia were more important than sort of the external policies. But to bring this back to a global context, it's interesting to recall when Xi Jinping became head of China in 2012, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union and ordered all the party cadres to see it. Now, if that film were in Europe, it would have Gorbachev as the hero that helped end the Cold War. The Chinese version is pretty different. Gorbachev is the fool that abandoned the Communist Party, led to the breakup of his country, and the not so subtle message is, it won't happen here. And so I think it's important as we think about the end of the Cold War to recognize the different context in Europe. Remember, in June of '89, you had Tiananmen Square. So at the same, many historians will focus on one sort of regional aspect. We could see the bloodletting in Tiananmen Square, and this obviously affected our view about how to try to deal with the events in Germany and Poland and others over the course of that same time period. Having said that, we should come back at some point to Fareed's point. I do think this application of new Cold War is a misplaced analogy, and I think it could lead people down dangerous paths.
I will come back to that in 1 minute, because I do think this is an important point, and I want to dive into it a little deeper. But Anne, just to sort of finish up the old Cold War conversation, in Eastern Europe, you do have this sense of liberation because the occupation ends, and so how thinking back over the past 30 years, what was the view in Warsaw, in Prague, in Bucharest, about where the destiny of these countries lay going forward? How was the end of the end of the Cold War in the West was the end of history. It's over. Now we can go and pay attention to what was happening at home. Very different in Eastern Europe. Very different kind of view of where the future was. And so how was the end of the Cold War really experienced? And what did it mean for the aspirations of the people in the region?
So first of all, it depends a little bit what you mean by Eastern Europe, because there were some differences. But a really, really important point to understand, and this is very relevant to the controversy that Bob just referred to over the expansion of NATO that took place and the expansion of the European Union over the next couple of decades. A really important point is that certainly for Central Europe, for Poland, for what was then Czechoslovakia, for Hungary, for the Baltic states, actually, and to a lesser extent, although eventually also true of Romania and Bulgaria, East Germany being a special case, the end of the Cold War meant absolutely that what we want is to be normal, and normal was Western Europe. And so these countries had real agency, and they pushed very hard, some of them, to enter NATO. So the first country that had the idea, again, I'm a little Polonocentric, but I do remember this moment in history. The first country to ask to join NATO was Poland. And it happened very, very fast, very soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then you very soon had others wanting to join, as I said, including the Baltic states who were former Soviet republics. And they were very eager to be part of the Western system, to be incorporated into Western alliances, precisely because of what Fareed just said, that the West had created this very attractive system of interlocking alliances and trading systems. It seemed open and peaceful and prosperous, and certainly much more attractive than what they had just come from and what they feared already back then might be coming in the East. So certainly in Central Europe, those countries that felt themselves to be strongly European, the drive was immediately join Europe, join every institution, do whatever it takes. And that was true really up until about 5 years ago when the paradigm shifted a little bit. But that absolutely held true for the first 25 years. A little bit further east in countries that had not had a prior experience of independence, or not one that was as strong and as long-lasting, when you get to Ukraine and Belarus, and the Caucasian countries, there was a lot more ambivalence about where do we go, who are we, even a certain identity crisis. I mean, that was absolutely true in Belarus, where people didn't know what nationality they were. And even in Ukraine, which is where there was a much stronger sense of national identity, the question of what it meant to be an independent country, and which camp do we belong to? We have all these historical links to Russia. We have all these, feelings about the West, was, persisted for 2 decades, and meant that by the time Ukraine decided it wanted to be a Western country, it was late, and it was a more difficult path to follow. And then finally, there's the very strange question of Russia. I think Bob is absolutely right that Russia was offered membership, certainly access to all the alliance clubs, including at one point the G8. The intention was, and the hope was, that Russia would become a Western country, or would become like a Western country, or would somehow be oriented in our direction and would become an ally. And there were people who either enthusiastically or optimistically or naively believed that that was going to be the case. But then, and I think had Russia been run differently in the second half of the 90s and 2000s, I can imagine a world in which that might have been true, or certainly more true than it is now. But what happened in Russia was that a contingent of very disgruntled, revanchist, former KGB officers took over the country. That's a longer story that's been very well told in a number of books, and set the country on a different course. And I do believe that it was these internal decisions inside Russia that led to this deep split between more or less the Western liberal world and Russian kleptocratic autocracy today. And it's, in fact, I think it's really one of the tragedies of the last 2 decades that set of decisions was made. I don't believe it was inevitable. It was, as Fareed said, contingent on particular people being in the right place at the right time, and a set of decisions that were made about leadership and the country's direction. But it wasn't for the West's lack of trying, or for their, or lack of intention to have Russia as an ally. I mean, and if you can recall, just at the moment, just after 9/11, even as late as that, there was a moment when it seemed like Russia was going to be our ally in this new conflict. I mean, there were a number of moments when that felt like a real possibility. And the fact that it didn't happen, there are lots of explanations for that, but I don't think the only explanations lie in the behavior of the West.
And indeed, Putin, and right after that time, actually starts talking about possibly joining NATO as part of that. And I think, Anne, also very important to recall, just as Bob did at the origins of NATO, is that these were demand-driven organizations. NATO was created because the Europeans needed it, and it was expanded because the Central Europeans wanted it. And I think that's an important part of how to think about history. Let me, in the last few minutes that we have left for Reed, turn to this issue of the new Cold War. And Secretary Baker, in his interview that we just heard, said that we are entering a new Cold War with China. You're dubious, already said that. But think about it. Is this the right framework to think about it, or should we think about the Cold War as a unique historical experience and find some other way to talk about this? And what is the danger, possibly, or not, of using the Cold War analogy for the situation that we are now in? 2 major powers clearly competing against each other for influence around the world, the United States and China.
I think it's a dangerous analogy to begin with, because it doesn't really capture the nature of the world. We are in a bipolar world. The United States and China are clearly head and shoulders above every other country, which was Morgenthau defined it by saying the numbers 1 and 2, there's a great chasm between them and everybody else. And that, you can look at the metrics, it's entirely true. But the big difference is this. The United States and the Soviet Union, in their best year during the Cold War, did $2 billion of trade that year. The United States and China do $2 billion of trade every day. So we're in a deeply economically intertwined and interdependent world. Secondly, let's remember what triggered the Cold War, as Anne pointed out. The Soviet Union effectively invaded almost a dozen countries around it and took them over and essentially turned them into colonies. China is building itself up militarily. It's pushing its weight around economically. It's becoming more repressive at home. But there's nothing on the scale of the kind of massive expansion of aggressive military power, really invading countries. I think there's no other way to describe it, that the Soviet Union did it. And that is really what triggered things. And then, further things. By the way, to add to the point Bob was making, the Marshall Plan was actually offered to Russia, and it was the Russians that turned it down. But Marshall very much wanted exactly to forestall a kind of militarized Europe, and therefore tried to see if he could get Russia also in on the recovery program. And finally, I would say the big difference is that the United States and its allies really have created this world that China in parts participates in fact, in many areas participates in, economically, technologically, and things like that. So while there is going to be clear competition, it's not clear to me that it is, two systems competing with one another. The Chinese really have no other system. I mean, we have 59 treaty allies. The Chinese have one, North Korea. The more likely analogy to me is Britain and Germany in the 1880s, 1890s. A lot of interdependence, a lot of trade, a lot of contact, but at the same time, competition. Now, I know that story doesn't end very well, but again, it gets back to this question of historical contingency. Did you have to was it inevitable that Britain and Germany would end up in a cataclysmic war? I tend to think, again, there was a mixture there. There was going to be competition. There was going to be systemic rivalry of some kind or the other. But did it have to end up in a war that really changed the shape of the world, in cataclysmic, seismic ways? I don't think so, and I hope not, and I hope we can learn from that and find a way to compete with China without going down that path.
Bob, you said the Cold War analogy was dangerous for American thinking about China. Expand on that. How would this lead us to take policy avenues that would enhance the possibility of conflict? And what's the alternative?
So, it's typical for people to use analogies because they allow sort of some sense of drawing together some paradigm. But as Fareed said, I think this one is not only inaccurate, but could lead us down a more dangerous path. If I were forced to come up with an analogy, I'd build on what Fareed said. I think it's more like a world of 1900 than a world of 1950. Now, in a world of 1900, you have authoritarian systems, and China's an authoritarian system. But as Fareed said, you can't contain China. Second, you don't have the Chinese occupation of Eastern Europe or Germany. And frankly, as also Anne mentioned, the Soviets in the early part of the Cold War had an ideological mission. I'm not sure I see that in China. I actually see a Han chauvinism. So yes, they've got a communist system, but frankly, they'll work with authoritarian systems or democracies, whatever serves their interests. And the reason I mentioned that documentary film is that this may be hard for Americans to fully understand, but China is a combination of hubris and insecurity. And so it's trying to actually preserve what it believes is its communist order, which is under threat. This goes back to your opening question. you don't have to agree with other parties, but it's useful to understand where they're coming from or sort of what they're thinking. I would say, though, in addition to Fareed's point, where China is sort of integrated in the system, it's trying to maneuver its people, its norms, its practices. Frankly, somebody who ran a multilateral institution, that doesn't shock me. What shocks me is that the U.S. pulled back for a number of years. But I do think China has a complementary system, which is sort of a tributary state model, which is a more traditional sort of Chinese system, which allows parties to do relatively well as long as they pay homage and respect to the emperor in Beijing. No doubt, as an authoritarian power, China would like to have hegemony in Asia. How likely is that with Japan and India and others if the United States plays its card rights but sort of doesn't overreact? In the case of Russia, does Russia have any ideological appeal? So I think, and then there's another part which, given what's going on in Glasgow, is important. The importance of transnational issues, climate change, biological security, international economics, cyber issues. How are you going to deal with these issues if you don't figure out some way to work with China and other parties? So I come back to this point I mentioned. What's quite interesting is the United States had a quite interesting developed foreign policy for 150 years involving sort of mediation, economics and trade, balance of power politics, some international law and cooperation concepts. As you know, Ivo, I wrote a book in part to try to draw people's attention to these ideas, but yet to fuse them with the alliance system that was built over this period. So the key danger is you can see a tendency in U.S. politics that we need to have an enemy, and we need to focus on militarizing it, and we need to focus on zero-sum assumptions. That is also an inheritance of the Cold War, and I think it's a risky one.
And let me turn to you finally. You're a student of authoritarianism, among many other things, and it does feel that China, certainly under Xi, has taken a great leap forward when it comes to authoritarianism. It's just this month that a new resolution was approved to deify, is that the right word? Probably not, Xi Jinping, but in some ways make him a historical figure on the par with Mao and Deng. And so when you think about that power that is now existing in China and how to deal with it, is the Cold War a bad analogy, or would you agree with Fareed and Bob that probably is distracting from what we really need to be thinking about?
So let me shift the question slightly and make it not just about China, because I do think that when you take a step back, what you do see now is something like an autocratic world beginning to emerge. And it's not organized around ideology. In fact, quite the contrary. It contains Chinese communists, Cuban communists, Bolivarian communists in Venezuela. It contains theocrats in Iran. It contains, right-wing nationalists in Russia, nationalists in Burma. But it is a world that sees itself and increasingly defines itself in opposition to the world of rule of law and the world of international institutions, and of course the world where human rights are a value, and seeks to support its members in pursuing their own interests, which are usually the interests of themselves in money, in kleptocratic forms of capitalism, and in remaining in power. And towards this end, they are willing to help one another. I mean, if you look at the case of Venezuela, for example, which is a country, far away in South America with nothing historically or geographically in common with China or Russia or Iran. And yet you see really important Chinese, Russian, and Iranian investments in Venezuela. You see help from the Cuban security services for Venezuela. You see Venezuela is able to sell its gold in Turkey. And because it has this support from all over the autocratic world, the sanctions that the United States and others in South America and Europe have put on Venezuela as a way of persuading it to return to a more, a path closer to the rule of law and less damaging, frankly, to its own citizens. Because of that, they've failed so far. And so I do think that although I don't know that Cold War is the right analogy, I do think that the values of what we used to call the West, maybe now we need another word for it, but the values of democracy, but even more than democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, respect for basic ways of basic understandings of how states should behave with one another. I do think all of that really is under attack from this, from a kind of autocratic world that wants something different and is now much more willing to take great lengths to achieve it. Whether it's the Belarusian dictator, hijacking a plane a Western plane in order to arrest a dissident, or whether it's the Saudi leaders murdering one of their dissidents in an embassy in Istanbul, or whether it's the Russians murdering people in England or in Germany. They are now much more willing to cross borders and enforce their version of law, which is not the rule of law, in other places. And I do think that the West or the democratic alliances or the alliance of democracies does need to begin to take this more seriously as an internal threat to our way of doing business, to our way of relating to one another, to our economic future, and to our prosperity.
Fascinating way to end this. The conflict and competition remain, of course, central, but values and define that competition, and that's in part what the Cold War was also about. I want to thank Anne Applebaum, Bob Zoellick, and Fareed Zakaria for really a terrific conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation, hopefully next time in person.